Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Tuesday night. You know, we talked earlier this week about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, about Ilhan Omar, about a number of members of our Congress. We now have two members of the House of Representatives who are Muslims, and it presents some interesting challenges, especially given some of the rather challenging things that Congresswoman Omar has had to say at a speech she gave in front of what I consider a terrorist front group. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. She described the 9/11 terrorist attacks as some people did something, which diminishes it quite a bit. And the bells ringing in the background are not, they might be the National Cathedral. Frank Gaffney, where are you right now?
I'm outside of the National Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, which is out in Washington. It is, I think, the largest religious structure in the Washington area, and I wasn't sure whether the bells were going to be going off while we were talking or not. But it's an appropriate backdrop to one of the things I had hoped to talk with you about, of course, which was the destruction of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
I'm glad you want to talk about that because I'm curious about it. They decided about an hour or hour and a half into the fire yesterday that they already knew it wasn't terrorism and it wasn't arson. And I wondered that has to be one of the fastest determinations to do it before the firefighters have even got water on the flames yet. They're already telling you what didn't cause it.
Well, Lars, I can't remember how many times we've had this conversation, but it pretty much tracks with just about every instance in which there is an act of terrorism. And the first thing that law enforcement says, as you may remember, for example, when we discussed Fort Hood, was it's not an act of terrorism. And I had somebody send me a note from a former senior law enforcement officer of a state who has had a lot of experience with, criminal activity and prosecutions and investigations and so on. And this individual said, there is simply no way you can do a proper analysis of whether something involved an act of arson while the fire is still burning. You need to be able to inspect the premises for evidence of, for example, flammable liquids or unusual wiring or other indicators that somebody was engaged in, as they say, foul play.
Yeah.
And so it fits a pattern here, Lars, and this is, of course, the French authorities rather than our own, but I'm fearful that we don't know the answer yet. And somebody said if the conduct of the investigators is as hapless as the conduct of the firefighters seemed to be, though there was some heroics there too, I'm sure, this is not going to be a very clean investigation or an authoritative one.
Well, it's interesting that yesterday on Fox News, Shep Smith, who tilts hard to the left on Fox, unfortunately, shut a guy down. He had a French elected official on, and the elected official was they wanted to get somebody on to react to what was happening. And he said, well, we do have to keep in mind that there's been an attack on a church in France almost every day for the last year. The total number, as I understand, is more than that. It's 700 or 800 attacks on French churches of various kinds. Arson is part of it. Some of it is just, smearing human waste or, damage, breaking things, that sort of thing. But in a country with 700 or 800 attacks on churches specifically over the course of a year, when the biggest church in the country catches fire and someone says it might be terrorism and everybody says, nope, no, it's not, no, it's not. We already know. We don't know what the fire was, but we know it wasn't that. You're right. It makes me very suspicious.
Well, me too. And I think if the sort of story sticks, if in other words the cover story, the authorities' claim is not actually evaluated on the basis or confirmed on the basis of a rigorous investigation, I fear the effect, Lars, is going to be what we've seen an awful lot of. Not only will there be no reporting on these kinds of matters, which has been true of these attacks on churches throughout France. And by the way, it's been true of a lot of other places in Europe as well. And more to the point, it's true of Christian persecution more generally around the world. And as you know, I'm working now in one of my roles as the president of a new organization, Save the Persecuted Christians. And it is absolutely astonishing to me how few people know that by some estimates there are 300 million Christians around the world who are not just having a bad day because of their faith, they're being heavily persecuted, which means they're being tortured, they're being raped, they're being sold into slavery, they're being expelled from their homes and losing everything and so on. In some cases murdered, even genocidally. That's happening in our world. And in much the same way that we're ignoring the attacks on churches in France or elsewhere in Europe, we are, I think, ignoring this larger problem of which this is clearly a symptom. Now, whether it's true of Notre Dame remains to be seen, I guess, but it is certainly true of this other pattern. And I just want to say, Lars, thank you for paying attention to this. Thank you for the kind of diligence that you bring to these matters, because your audience needs it, and so do every American.
Believe me, I get blowback on this. I'm talking to Frank Gaffney, who's the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. But, Frank, I get people saying, well, you want to jump right to this. I said, no, I'm just... when I was watching the live coverage yesterday before I went on the air for several hours, I just was stunned, that the flames were going, the church was being consumed. They didn't have a drop of water on it yet. And I heard one of the announcers, either on CNN or on Fox, say, well, the French authorities have announced that it's not terrorism and it's not arson. And I thought, you haven't even you're not even at the fire scene yet. I mean, you're not inside to see what happened. Now, I would expect that if it turns out as suspected by the authorities, that it is in fact something due to the renovation. Well, they were about to shut the church down, close the doors for the evening last night French time, not last night our time, when the fire broke out. And I thought, well, that would be a good time if you were going to set a fire to have it start when everybody's leaving the building, and then it has a chance to get going. If the building is populated, then people are more likely to notice it faster and maybe get it put out. But instead, it hit at the close of day. And you'd think if some of the workers, and everybody got out, but if some of the workers had gone to the authorities yesterday and said, oh, yeah, I accidentally kicked over a can of paint thinner, and it was right next to a blowtorch, or, a lot of the tools, there are a lot of construction fires that happen when either flames or electrical heating devices come into contact with stuff that burns, yeah, you can get a fire. But you would expect that those stories would have been related to the police very quickly. Instead, they don't have any idea what caused it, but they know for sure it's not arson or terrorism already. And that one just doesn't add up, Frank. So I'm gonna keep my powder dry on this one and just wait and hear what happens. We'll have to talk about Ilhan Omar another time. But Frank, thanks so much for what you do at the Center for Security Policy. My pleasure, Lars. Just two quick words. Yeah. The workmen, I'm told, were off for 2 hours before the fire started. There you go. That explanation is unlikely. Yeah, it does seem to be unlikely. So 2 hours gone. They're about to close the doors, but it had been open to the public apparently up to that point. And I'll tell you another observation I've got, and you tell me I'm wrong. There are a couple of buildings under construction or renovation near where our broadcast studios are, and I was thinking today as I walked past one of them's about a 15-story building. I thought if I put on a hard hat and a Carhartt jacket and a pair of my work boots from home, I'll bet I could probably walk onto that job site and be there for a while before anybody came up and said, hey, you don't have the right security badge to be in here. And I think that's a possibility, too.